I'm telling you, man, they're fucking aliens. Spacemen. Mark looked earnest, and he was panting for breath, but I was far from convinced. Deciding to hear him out, I put down my screwdriver and set the flat pack instructions to the side. The bookcase could wait. What are you talking about? Who's a spaceman? Them! Mark's hands were on his knees, and he was struggling to breathe, but he raised one to point towards the window. Those things outside! I stood and made my way to the window, glancing back at Mark with raised eyebrows as I went. The curtains were closed because the sunlight was blinding me while I was trying to work, so I opened them. Sure enough, there were some people out in the street. It was unusual for there to be so many strangers outside. The cul-de-sac generally only had residents going from their front doors to their cars, but they didn't look like aliens to me. If anything, they looked like council workers. Several of them were wearing high visibility vests. Maybe there's a burst water pipe or something. What? Mark was by my side and cut me off. They weren't there before. You have to believe me. Are you playing some kind of game, mate? I've got work to do. Alice won't be happy if I don't get this bookshelf built. Even if we are being invaded by spacemen. Mark flew into a rage. You think this is funny? It's a cover-up. Has to be. You're in on it, aren't you? I told him to relax, raised my hands to chest height and showed him my palms, just so he knew I was innocent. You practically kicked my door in and shouted about aliens outside, and look, there's no one there, Mark. Just some bloody workmen, that's all. They weren't there before. You have to believe me. Whatever you say, mate. Sit down. I'll make you a cuppa and you can tell me all about it. I think I have some chocolate digestives in the cupboard. Are you bloody mad? He yelled back at me. We're being invaded and you're talking about fucking biscuits? This was my opportunity to lighten the mood a bit. I'll get the biscuits, mate, but whether you make love to them or not is entirely up to you. Mark stared at me as though I was insane. Slowly, realization crept across his face. But instead of laughing at my attempted humour, he snarled, Ha fucking ha. You're a fucking riot. You know what? Fuck you, Jeff. Yeah, fuck you. He continued saying that as he made his way to the hallway. It's strange, really, because I don't think I've ever heard him swear before. I don't imagine that anyone ever had. I mean, he was the village's vicar, for God's sake. Chuckling at the absurdity, I called after him, Make sure you go out the back, Mark. There are little green men out the front. The back door slammed with a final farewell, fuck you. It was all very odd, and if I'd known that that would be the last moment I would ever see one of my oldest friends, I probably wouldn't have taken the mickey quite as much. You live and learn, I suppose, even if not necessarily for very long. Focusing on building the furniture was pretty difficult after Mark's visit, so I just sat in silence for a while. The workmen outside were making quite a bit of noise. It sounded like they were digging. I felt I owed it to my friend to find out exactly what was going on, so I slipped into my running shoes without bothering to undo the laces and went out of the front door. One of the workers was leaning against my wall. He seemed to be the one in charge, judging by the clipboard he was studying. A large amount of dirt was piling up just outside my gate. Much more and my driveway would be blocked. Hello, can I help you gentlemen with anything? I called out to them as I approached. The man with the clipboard nearly jumped out of his skin. I must have frightened him. He wiped his brow as he recovered and faced me. No thank you, friend. We have everything under control. Weird accent, I thought to myself, but I couldn't quite place it. Maybe that's what Mark meant when he said they were aliens. Foreigners. I'd never known him to be xenophobic, though, and his wife was from Vietnam, which made that theory even more doubtful. Besides, he distinctly said spacemen. Perhaps they were Russian cosmonauts, hired by the council to replace their useless personnel. It made sense to me. You seem to be working pretty hard. Can I get you some water or something? Cup of tea, perhaps? The guy looked shocked, or maybe embarrassed. Either way, his expression was peculiar, and his already extremely pale skin seemed to grow whiter. No thanks. We dig. Only dig. That's what we're here for. What are you digging exactly? I leaned past him so I could get a better look at what they were doing. His 3 colleagues had made a pretty decent opening in the ground. 6 paving slabs had been removed and were resting neatly against my neighbour's wall. The hole itself was perfectly round and went into the earth at a slight angle, so that a man could walk down the incline as comfortably as descending stairs. It was at least 2.5 meters deep from what I could see. I kicked some of the spoils away from my driveway while the man uncomfortably struggled to find an answer. Before he could say anything, I decided to press him. "Who do you work for, anyway?" "Council," he said, and tugged at his high visibility vest, as though that would prove it. "You got any ID?" Letters about bogus callers had been posted all over the notice board at the community centre, so it was fresh in my mind to ask. Sure enough, the man produced a badge bearing the council's logo from his trouser pocket. It even told me his name. Dasniel Santiski. Pretty weird. Weirder still was his uniform. I hadn't noticed until then, but his grey trousers were a really funny shape. They were sticking out at the sides, almost like those horse-riding pants that German officers wore during World War II. Jodhpurs, I believe you call them. "So, Mr. Santiski, what Zantizgi," he corrected me. "I'm sorry. Anyway, what are you digging? And if you don't mind me asking, where are you from?" "We dig hole, and we from council. We has work to do, if you please." He tapped his clipboard and then pointed back to the opening in the pavement. At this point, I'd had about enough. I guessed Mark had gotten frustrated after talking to this joker. "Right, you said that already. Why are you digging a hole next to my house? You're blocking my driveway. Even while we've been talking, you've added a foot to the pile. How am I meant to get my car out?" I had no intention of going anywhere, but he didn't need to know that. "I sorry," he said. "After we dig, we move dirt." "Fine. So what country are you from?" "Mies," he said and turned away from me. Clearly he felt the conversation was over. I had never heard of a country called Mies before, and for a moment I wondered if it was just his pronunciation that was off. That seemed unlikely, however, because no one mispronounces the name of their own country. It seemed more likely that it was a place we English speakers mispronounced, like how we say Munich instead of München. Either way, I wasn't about to admit defeat, so rather than walking back to the house with my tail between my legs, I thought I'd take a stroll to the shop. Surprise grabbed me when I reached the T-junction at the bottom of the cul-de-sac. Dotted at various points in both directions were squads of council workers, each group digging its own hole. Every worker that I could see was wearing the unusual jodhpurs, and shared Mr. Santiski's milky complexion. Likely they were all him's countrymen. Perhaps this was a new foreign invasion from Eastern Europe. Cohorts of migrant workers taking our British jobs and all that sensationalized tabloid nonsense. I decided to pick up a couple of those papers when I got to the shop. But still, they were clearly people, and not spacemen. I kept going toward the shop. By this point I was getting a little concerned, and I figured Mrs. Ledger, the shop's owner, might have some answers. She always knew what was going on, and could be relied upon to make sure everyone else knew as well. Old man Kennedy, a wrinkly, scrotum-faced misery of a man, first found out about Mrs. Kennedy's affair by visiting Ledger's village shop. She was 40 years his junior, so no one blamed her for straying. After all, it was a 25-year-old one from someone pushing 70. Money, I suppose. Anyway, word had it that Mrs. Ledger even told him where and when he could catch her in the act. It came as a shock to everyone to learn, from Mrs. Ledger of course, that her infidelity wasn't with her personal trainer like everyone suspected. It was actually, well, apparently, with one of her customers' pets. You see, she ran a dog walking business, and she supposedly met a Great Dane that she just couldn't resist. I would have paid good money to see old man Kennedy's jowls flap when he caught them in the act. I'm not sure I believe it in all honesty, but Mrs. Ledger was superbly well informed, and before retiring, her husband John had been some sort of gardening consultant for the council. It would be incredibly unlikely if Mrs. Ledger didn't have her finger on this particular pulse. On my way I passed at least a dozen digging teams. They weren't using any specialist equipment or anything, just shovels and good old-fashioned elbow grease. Remarkably for council workers, I didn't spot a single one smoking or eating a sandwich. They were all hard at work, and clearly the holes were progressing well. Spoil heaps, up to 3 meters high and several meters long, were blocking some areas of the footpath. From one of the holes I saw 9 workmen appear, wiping their brows in the hot sun. After they caught their breath and exchanged a few words with their clipboard-wielding supervisor, they walked right back to the hole and resumed work. 2 of them went ahead and the rest lined up in a human chain, passing the shoveled dirt out into the open. At the top of the hole were 3 more workers who placed the dirt onto the heap. It was terribly efficient. I realised then that I had probably only seen part of the digging crew outside of my own house. Most likely I had only witnessed the beginnings of the hole, and more people would arrive to deepen it later. The spoil heap hadn't been big enough to conceal large numbers of workers underground. Even though I was watching them very close, the workers paid me no attention. I didn't stop to question the supervisor. Instead I continued on my way. Until I arrived at Ledger's village shop, I really hadn't thought about the lack of non-council people in the streets. But when I got there, I knew why I hadn't bumped into anyone on the way. They were all shopping. Or they thought Mrs. Ledger could fill them in on the council's latest plans. That's what I was hoping for, after all. The shop was pretty small, just a few shelves squeezed into a narrow box of a room. It contained everything you could possibly need, though. Fresh meat, vegetables, cereal, toilet paper, you know, a normal village convenience store. But it struggled to hold the 20 or so people that were stuffing into it. Through the press I could see Mrs. Ledger behind her counter. She was clearly trying to say something, but I couldn't hear a word of it because people were far too loud. I've always been able to project my voice fairly well, so I thought I'd call for some quiet. "Hello, Mrs. Ledger!" I shouted as loud as I could, without really yelling. The raised voices squabbling stopped almost immediately, and everyone turned to face me. Some of their mouths were hanging agape as I started to make my way to the counter. It was difficult for them to make room for me, but somehow they created a path for me to get to the front of the haphazard queue. "Good morning, Geoffrey," Mrs. Ledger said to me. "It's nice to see we haven't all forgotten our manners." She cast a disapproving glance around at the other shoppers. Some of them hung their heads in shame, while others grumbled noisily about me pushing in. "I just wanted to get some bread, Mrs. Ledger, and I hoped you might know something about these council workers and their holes." A flustered-looking man standing to my right, with a bright red face and a 1930s fighter pilot moustache, spoke up before Mrs. Ledger could answer. "He wants bread! Pah! It's the end of the world, Sonny, and you're not taking the last loaf." "End of the world?" I laughed. "Have you been talking to Mark?" "It's no joke, Geoffrey," Mrs. Ledger assured me. "People are saying that the aliens are taking over the Earth. Rebecca Sharp phoned earlier and said it was even on the news." Things were getting pretty weird. "What news? I didn't see it." "Turn on your telly then, if you please, Mrs. Ledger, and we'll have a look." A rumble of agreement worked its way through the gathering, and Mrs. Ledger changed the channel on the television that doubled as a completely unnecessary CCTV monitor. No one in the village would rob the shop, so it was probably just there to keep the insurance costs down. Nothing showed up on the screen except static snow. The gathered villagers started to shout again, gripped by some sort of panic. I didn't believe a word of it. "This is nonsense!" I shouted, and everyone looked at me with expectation in their eyes. They were losing it, I could tell, and they hoped that I could help them. I didn't really share their optimism in that department. After all, what can a middle-aged librarian do against invading aliens? Not much. At least not if they were actually invading aliens. "Listen, everybody!" I raised my hands in a similar calming gesture to the one I'd tried on Mark before he stormed off. I decided not to try any jokes this time. "I'll go out and get some answers from the workers. I spoke to one outside my house, as it happens, and he showed me his ID. He was from the council." At that point, I was sure that it was all just some kind of mass hysteria. Some strange work had been set in place by the council, and people were freaked out by the fact that all the workers were foreign. It's built into our collective psyche to fear the unknown, and we British are patriotic to the point of borderline racist at the best of times. This really wasn't such a big deal. Just the perfect circumstances all occurring simultaneously to create a bit of moderate panic. I recognised a fair few people in the shop. Some I knew by name and others I had passed in the street pretty often. One of them, Alan Whitfield, had played badminton with me many times over the years, but that stopped when his son was knocked over by a truck. He didn't die or anything, but Alan vowed to spend all of his time with him from then on. It was actually a bit of a surprise that Alan Jr. wasn't there with him. It was rare he'd leave him alone. "You want to come, Alan? Help me get to the bottom of this?" He looked down and said nothing, awkwardly wringing his hands together. "Fine." The people parted to let me through, and I marched to the shop's entrance. "Be careful," I heard Mrs. Ledger call after me. It had gotten uncharacteristically hot for the time of year. Summer was still a couple of months away, but I could feel the sun's strength on my bare forearms and face. The brightness made me squint a bit. The closest set of workmen were across the street, no more than 100 metres away. They were the only ones in sight. Other holes were hidden from me by the curve in the road. "Hey, hello!" I jogged towards them. Their clipboard guy looked over to me, waved and started walking to meet me. Yes? How can I help? He had the same weird accent as the man inside my house, and the same unhealthy complexion and weird expression. Are you from Humours too? Yes. I can help you? Have much digging to do. Yeah, so I see. Please. I'm sure the team can dig without you for just a couple of minutes. I really need your help. You see that lock back there? I pointed across the street at the cluster of people around the shop's door. They could really do with an explanation. The man's pale face looked completely heartbroken, panicked even. He kept glancing from the shop to his digging team, clearly unable to make a decision. I put my hand on his shoulder. It was surprisingly bony. Everything's fine, just 2 minutes, please. It really would help put everyone's mind at ease. Slumping slightly, the man sighed and started walking across the street with me. The clipboard man was small in stature, but the shop's inhabitants shrunk away from him nonetheless. I thought I'd better say something. Right, this is Mr. I motioned for the man to help me, and he didn't let me down. Fozliniak, he finished for me. Mr. Fozliniak, right, and he's going to tell us what the deal is with all the holes. Isn't that right, Mr. Fozliniak? No. He started shaking his head rapidly and made to walk away from us. Only dig, must dig, all day digging, then everything okay. Dig. No, wait, Chief. It was the fat man with the red face. He rushed forward and grabbed the clipboard guy by the shirt. I want answers, pal. We all do. The group was getting excited, and I had a sudden feeling that they'd turn nasty and lynch the poor fellow. Mr. Fozliniak, please just tell them what's going on. The fat man still had hold of him, and, despite his squirming, the man with the clipboard couldn't get away. A woman shouted from inside the shop. I don't think it was Mrs. Ledger. Let him go, Harold! He's just doing his job! Fat Harold didn't let go, but I bet he wishes he had. The squirms turned to desperate thrashes, but still Harold kept his grip. The struggle made his cheeks wobble and his moustache wave in the air. Just as I was about to intervene, something truly unexpected happened. Had I not witnessed it and all the things that followed, there's no way I would believe it was possible. The guy with the clipboard stepped back with so much force that his entire outer layer, by which I mean his skin, was pulled off. It tore slowly at first, like stretching rubber, and then split suddenly, tearing off his body with a disgusting sound that was like a bizarre mixture between the noise a boot makes when you're trying to free it from a deep mud and ripping a piece of paper. There was no blood, but the exposed flesh beneath the torn skin and clothes still managed to make someone vomit behind me. Fat Harold let go and stumbled backwards to the ground, screeching like a gelded piglet. I was in complete shock and just stared. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. The man with the clipboard shook himself free of the remains of his outer skin and revealed a brown body. The eyes were a little larger than a person's and looked in every way to be compound, like those of an insect. The reason for the peculiar trousers became apparent to me then. They concealed an extra pair of limbs. Naked of its former covering, the being before me was now unrecognizable as the man who had called himself Fozliniak. It was a true monstrosity, and I knew then that the alien invasion was really underway. Obviously, we all ran from the thing. We piled back into the shop and shut the door. Mrs. Ledger quickly bolted it, and then went back behind the counter, where she sat blubbering on the floor. I have to admit, I found it hard to do anything except stare out of the window, even while the panicked shoppers whimpered and shouted all around me. My eyes were fixed on the bizarre insect man outside. The mouth was hideous, similar to a bubbling crab. I had never realized just how disgusting insect mandibles and mouthpads were until then. No wonder he'd had a strange expression on his face. Hiding that must be difficult. The convincing disguise was very impressive. Once its extra legs were free, the alien's entire stature changed. Now it walked on 4 legs, with the brown abdomen sticking out behind it as it ran towards the digging team across the street. When it reached its fellows, the creature began flailing its arms around. Clearly it was describing the problem to the other workers. The clipboard was no longer in his hands. I scanned the pavement outside and spotted it almost immediately. It was only about a metre from the door. I'm going out, I said. Nobody heard me over the commotion, but I got some strange looks as I started to force my way back to the door. "Stop pushing!" a teenage girl I didn't recognize said. "I have to go out." "What? No, you can't." Her eyes darted around looking for support. "I need to go out there," I told her. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention from the other shoppers, but that's exactly what I got. The girl's voice turned to a screech. The pitch was so high that I was surprised my age still allowed me to hear it. "Help! Help! He wants to open the door! Don't let him! Please don't open the door!" She wrapped her scrawny arms around me. I wasn't sure if it was a comforting hug or if she was trying to restrain me, but she was failing either way. I needed to get the clipboard, so I just kept going with her holding on. Fat Harold blocked the door. He would be more difficult to get past. The hard set of his jaw told me that he meant business, and he had no intention of letting me leave. I figured I'd appeal to his reasonable side, if he had one. "Harold, isn't it?" I said. "Listen, I have to get out there to see what's on that clipboard. Maybe it'll help us." You're not going anywhere, and if you try to open the door, I'll... "You'll what, Harold? Kill him?" Alan had come to my rescue. "I'll do whatever I can to stop you, both of you if I have to. You're not opening that door. That thing is out there. You don't understand, none of you. I touched him, and his skin came off. He'll kill me for that. Eat me, probably. You're not opening that door. No way." An old lady appeared by my side. She must have been at least 90. "Now, Harold, you let these nice gentlemen through. Everything'll be..." "No, Mother. No way. No one is opening the door." The old lady touched my elbow. "I'm sorry about Harold, dear. He can be awfully stubborn when he wants to be, but he's a good boy, really. He does this every day when I tell him to eat his greens." "Mother!" Harold hissed through clenched teeth. His eyes darted around to everyone in the room, and his face went even darker shade of red. The ends of his moustache were drooping. My guess was that the revelation about the vegetables had embarrassed him, and so it should. The man was about 50, for God's sake. "Now you're going to open this door for the nice man, and then you're going to get out of the way so we can all have a look at that clipboard. Okay, Harold? Are you going to kill me too?" Harold gulped and turned to unbolt the lock. Thankfully, he was a good enough boy not to argue with his mother. I took the opportunity to peer out of the window. The workmen from across the street had stopped digging and were looking over towards the shop. The skinless one was pointing. To my horror, I saw more of them disrobing themselves of their human disguises. There were 20 at least, each as grotesque as the next. Harold was too flustered to manage the lock properly, so I took matters into my own hands. I grabbed him by his shoulders and yanked him away from the door. Maybe I should have done that in the first place. I have no idea what happened to him once he was out of the way, but I assume Alan and the others kept hold of him because he didn't try to attack me from behind. The insect men were almost upon me by the time I got the clipboard and rushed back to the door. I could hear their clacking mouth parts after the door was shut behind me. "Give us the plans," one of them called from outside. I glanced down at the piece of paper on the clipboard, but all it showed was a childlike sketch of a bunch of tunnels like the inside of an anthill. That made sense, but they were hardly sophisticated blueprints. "The plans are crap," I called back. "They don't show anything." "Stupid humans." The irritation was easy to hear despite the accent. For some reason, it was at this point that I realized exactly how ridiculous this entire situation was. Here we had alien insect men who made buzzing sounds when they talked like some sort of pantomime bee accent. Madness. Bees don't make that sound with their mouths, for God's sake. "You can have the plans back," Fat Harold shouted from my left. "Just don't eat us!" I was in complete agreement with him. The drawings on the clipboard were no help to us, and the last thing I wanted was to make our potential new insect overlords mad. "I'm coming out with the clipboard," I said loud and clear. "Do I have your word, Mr. Fosliniak, that none of you will eat or in any way harm the people in the shop?" Yes, just give plans. We must dig to make safe." I opened the door. Mrs. Ledger, the teenager, and Fat Harold's mother were huddled in a tearful embrace of womanly comfort behind me. Everyone else was completely silent. With the clipboard held out at arm's length, I stepped into the light. As soon as I was clear of the threshold, an angry-looking insect man snatched the plans from me. "You will help us now, humans. Too much time wasted on stupid humans. Now Earth's folk and him's folk must dig together." "You want us to help you take over?" Alan said from the doorway. "We're not doing that," Harold chimed in. "If you want to conquer us, you can do it on your own. We'll stay here in the shop." A rumble of agreement worked its way through all the humans present. The insect men looked at each other, then Fosliniak held up a hand. "Up to you, humans. Too much time wasted. We dig now. Only dig." We barricaded ourselves in the shop and watched the insect men get back to work. They doubled their efforts, digging with a new urgency. It was marvellous to behold. They shifted so much earth that before long the spoil heap had tripled in size. That was when I noticed the insect men started to look up at the sky more and more often. At first I thought it was just because clouds had darkened the previously glorious day, but then I realised that they were looking out for something. They seemed nervous. I figured they were probably waiting for their queen to arrive. I said as much to Alan, and he agreed that was probably most likely. Somewhere up on the mothership, there was a fat-bottomed ant queen, waiting to check out her new underground palace before she took over the rest of the planet. Something was odd though, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. If the insect men had come to conquer Earth, why didn't they just force us to dig the holes? My only explanation was that they must be the workers, and that the soldiers would arrive later. Maybe as well as the palace, they were digging barrack chambers beneath the ground. Either way, most of the shop people weren't interested in my theories. They were mostly crying about their children or helping themselves to Mrs. Ledger's supplies. I took a bottle of 7-Up with permission, but some of the others didn't even bother to ask. Animals. The thought to call the police had of course occurred to us as well. We soon realised, however, that the shop's payphone and all our mobiles were out of action. I was pretty distressed at this, as you can probably imagine. I wanted to call Alice, my wife, to make sure that she was all right, and to let her know that if I came out of this alive, the bookshelf would still be finished. The sun was soon completely blocked, and everything turned dark. Unfortunately, the shop's window faced north, so we had no idea what was causing the darkness. We found out soon enough. In some ways, it was a welcome distraction from my thoughts. At least I wasn't worrying about Alice. I was only worrying about myself. The ground shook violently, causing some of the cereal boxes to fall from the top of the shelves. Everyone was frightened, and a couple of people were in tears. The rest of us watched the insect men across the street and listened. Sunlight had returned to the world, confirming my suspicions that something large had moved across the sun and then landed. The insect men seemed to be gesturing for us to join them as they darted for their hole and all vanished inside it. None of us moved, and silence reigned for a few heartbeats. Another earth-shaking thump made us all huddle together behind the counter. Even through the terror, I found Harold's body odour offensive and held my nose as I waited to see what would happen. More thumps followed, and they were getting more and more distant. In my mind, I pictured giant War of the Worlds-esque tripods scouring the land for people. That's the moment I decided to go outside. Not one person tried to stop me as I went towards the door. They just watched with eager fascination. The door creaked slightly as I pulled it open. The day was calm now, and the hot sunshine had returned. I made my way around the side of the building to see what had been responsible for the thumping sounds, but I saw nothing except houses and trees. Whatever it was had gone to lower ground. The shop was at the highest point of the village, near the school. The best place to go, I decided, was to the insect man hole across the road. I ran there as quickly as I could and looked inside. Nothing. All I could see beyond the entrance was blackness. After taking a look back at the shop, I decided to go in. "Hello?" I called after a few meters. There was no response and I couldn't see anything. I listened for movement deeper, but there was nothing. The insect man knew how to keep quiet. that's for sure. I went back to the surface and immediately regretted it. Something else was falling to the ground. It was set to land right between the hole and the shop, and it was large. From below I could easily make out the general shape of it. It was an animal, no doubt about it, clearly reptilian and at least 50 feet long from head to tail. I didn't see it land because I hid myself a little beyond the rim of the opening, but I felt it. The earth shook far more violently than it had in the shop, and I almost fell over. I had to take another look at it. Peering over the edge, I looked long and hard. I recognized the creature immediately. It was an enormous chameleon. Their bulbous eyes moved independently of each other, scanning the environment. To my horror, looking up into the sky revealed more of the falling monstrosities. Soon the whole village would be overrun with these gigantic beasts. The landing reptile must have caused an accident in the shop because I could see smoke rising from the doorway. Moments later, the shoppers all ran from the door into the street. The first few were knocked to the ground by all those coming from behind. They'd stopped, mouths open in shock, to gape at the huge chameleon before them. The chameleon responded in a predictable way, both of its eyes fixed on the tangle of shoppers as they tried to get up from the ground. The creature's mouth began to open, slowly and deliberately, as it gently rocked from side to side. In the blink of an eye, its long tongue shot out and snatched up Fat Harold's mother. The tongue's tip wrapped around her head, so if she screamed, no one heard it. I did hear the crunch she made when the mouth closed on her, and I had to look away. Harold couldn't take it. I looked back just in time to see him running into the burning building. Despite the fact that the flames were now easily visible through the window, the other shoppers screamed and huddled together. Another of the chameleons landed further down the road and wasted little time in joining the feast. After seeing several more of the shoppers being snatched, I decided to take my chances in the hole. It went deep, but I found the insect men before long. "We dig to save humans," Fusliniak explained. "Council send us to make Earth safe from chameleon menace." They're a menace, all right. They're eating everyone. But why did the council send foreigners? People would have listened to English people or even Scots this far north. British people work too slow and ask for too much money. That was fair enough, I figured.